In the sweltering heat of an 1880s Arkansas summer, a boy named Elijah Porter stood barefoot in the red clay yard behind a weather-worn wooden shack. His feet were thick with dirt, his hands blistered from chopping firewood, and his shirt, hand-sewn in 2 sizes too big, clung to his small frame like a wet rag. Elijah was 12 years old, but life had aged him fast. His voice, however, told a different story. It wasn't just a voice. It was something richer, deep and velvet smooth, with the kind of melancholy edge that made even old men pause mid-sentence to listen. It didn't match his body, nor his age. Townsfolk said it sounded like he had swallowed a grown man's sadness. That voice had become his only possession, more valuable than his boots, his food, or the tarnished photograph of his mother that he kept folded in his coat pocket. He'd never known his father, and now, with the crops failing, his mother sick in bed, and the local sawmill cutting wages again, that voice might be all that could save them. In towns like Pine Hollow, nobody got rich. You either worked the fields or worked the rail. And Elijah had done both before he could count to 20. His life wasn't a life. It was a long, looping routine of labor. But every once in a while, in the quiet moments between supper and sleep, he'd sit on the porch and hum old tunes he didn't even remember learning. He'd sing low spirituals his mama had passed down. And sometimes, just sometimes, a neighbor would drift close enough to hear and freeze. One old woman once said it gave her the shivers in her bones, like a ghost had brushed past her. Rumors began to spread. That boy's got something strange in his throat, one man muttered, like he's been touched by an angel or something else. Others began to gather by the roadside near dusk, hoping to hear him sing. But Elijah didn't want to sing for free. Not anymore. His mother's medicine cost more than a week's wages, and the rent collector didn't take kind words or good intentions. So one evening, with a torn scrap of butcher paper and a stub of charcoal, he wrote a sign and nailed it to a crooked fence post. "We'll sing for 5 cents. The first night, no one came. The second, a woman gave him 2 pennies and asked for a lullaby. By the end of the week, he had a small crowd and a tin cup half full of nickels and dimes. He started performing at the train station every Thursday when the express line came through. Railroad men, traveling salesmen, and wide-eyed children stood in hushed rows to hear the boy's velvet voice glide through old hymns and broken-hearted folk songs. One conductor dropped a silver $50 in the cup and said, "You've got the voice of a man twice your age and 10 times your sorrow." It wasn't long before strangers started showing up. Men in fine coats with soft shoes and smooth accents. One offered to take Elijah up north to record his voice on one of those newfangled wax cylinders. Another claimed he could turn Elijah into a stage act, maybe even get him on a vaudeville tour. But Elijah's mother was still too sick to travel, and he couldn't bear the thought of leaving her behind. Still, the idea simmered. Maybe, just maybe, his voice could carry him farther than his feet ever could. What Elijah didn't know, standing under that swaying oak tree with a crowd of strangers tossing coins into a coffee tin, was that he was about to make a decision that would change his life forever. Not because of fame, not even for fortune, but because one man in that crowd wasn't there for music. He was there to buy Elijah's voice. It was a humid Friday afternoon when Elijah first saw him. Among the regulars, farmhands leaning on fence posts, barefoot children clutching coppers, and an old fiddler tapping his cane in rhythm, stood a man who didn't belong. His shoes were polished, his coat was pressed, and he wore a tan bowler hat tilted just enough to hide his eyes from the glaring sun. He wasn't sweating like the rest of them, and his hands, soft, unscarred, held a notebook and a gold-plated fountain pen. He didn't applaud when Elijah finished his song. Didn't smile, didn't nod. Just watched, measured, studied. The boy noticed, of course, but he had learned not to look too long at the well-dressed types. They usually didn't tip, and if they spoke at all, it was with words too big and slow to mean anything useful. That night, as Elijah counted coins on the porch steps, the man approached. "You sing like a man with gravel in his heart," he said, voice smooth as river water. "You ever think of putting that voice to better use?" Elijah looked up, cautious. "I do use it." The man smiled, showing teeth too white for Pine Hollow. "Let me rephrase. I represent a very particular employer. Someone who collects Ray talents. Voices, mostly, and is very interested in yours. Elijah squinted. You mean like a recording deal? No, the man said. Not quite. He knelt beside the boy, careful not to stain his trousers. From inside his coat, he pulled a thin silver case, opening it to reveal a document. A contract, tied with red string and sealed with wax. You would still have your body, the man explained calmly, your mind, your memories. But the voice, that thing that makes people stop and listen, it wouldn't be yours anymore. My employer would take ownership. Permanently. Elijah blinked. You mean I couldn't sing? You wouldn't want to. It'd be gone. Hello. Like knocking on an empty barrel. He tapped the contract. In return, you'd be paid. Handsomely. Enough for a house, a doctor, even to move your mima somewhere cool and clean. Elijah stared at him, lips parted. The man softened. You wouldn't need to sing anymore. You could rest. Just rest. The offer slithered into his ear and stayed there. That night, Elijah sat at his mother's bedside, holding her hand. She slept lightly, breath wheezy, skin damp. The medicine wasn't working. Or maybe it had never been real medicine to begin with. Just root teas and sugar water from the traveling apothecary. He couldn't afford a real doctor. Not unless he did something drastic. He picked up the silver case and reread the contract under the yellow porch light. It wasn't long. 1 page. Simple language. No tricks. No hidden clauses. Just a single trade. His voice, for a lifetime sum. He whispered aloud, just to hear it. A boy who sold his voice. The words chilled him. The next day, the man was back, waiting by the oak tree. Elijah had expected some flicker of glee in his eyes. But the man's face remained impassive, professional. Do people really do this? Elijah asked. Sell parts of themselves. More than you'd think, the man replied. Voices, memories, even dreams. Some folks have nightmares so bad they pay to forget them. Others just want peace and quiet in their heads. Elijah didn't ask if they regretted it. He didn't want to know. He signed. The man tucked the contract neatly back into the case, clicked it shut, and nodded. It's done. At first, nothing happened. Elijah stood still, waiting for some thunderclap, some wind to whoosh through him. But the world was silent. Then he tried to hum. No sound came, not even a rasp. His throat didn't hurt. His chest didn't ache. He just couldn't. The crowd began to murmur. One little girl tugged her father's hand, asking when the song would start. But Elijah only stood there, lips moving silently like a goldfish in a bowl. The man tipped his hat and walked away. That night, Elijah didn't count coins. There were none, only the silver case tucked under his bed, and a fresh envelope inside it, stuffed thick with crisp bills. His mother's medicine arrived 3 days later by express rail. A real doctor came from Little Rock, and by the next full moon, they were living in a brick house with clean sheets and proper glass windows. But the voice, the one that had once carried whole crowds into stillness, was gone. Not damaged, not changed, gone. The brick house was the nicest thing Elijah had ever seen up close. It sat on the edge of town, with a wraparound porch and shutters painted the color of sweet corn. There were 2 real bedrooms, one for him, one for Mama, and a pantry deep enough to echo when you clapped. For the first few days, they just walked around, opening drawers and smiling at light switches like they were magic. Mama regained her color quickly. The new doctor, Dr. Satterfield, came twice a week, didn't charge extra for Sunday visits, and never looked down on them like the clinic folks in town used to. He even brought books. For the boy, he'd say, laying down worn copies of Emerson or Twain. Reading strengthens what's left if the throat goes quiet. Elijah smiled politely. He couldn't exactly thank him. The silence was strange at first. Not painful, just unfamiliar. He could still cough, still breathe, still eat. But speaking, singing, gone. He'd try sometimes when he was alone, humming to himself under the covers or mouthing lullabies on the back porch. But nothing came, not even the scratch of a whisper. His body still made the motions, but the sound had been scooped clean out of him. And yet, life went on. He began writing more. Notes to Mama, short stories, scraps of poems. He'd scribble jokes on slips of paper and leave them by her tea mug. She'd laugh and say, "You're still my boy, just quieter now." In town, people didn't understand at first. The old fiddler assumed he'd caught a bad flu. Others thought it was stage fright or broken heart. Some were angry, like they'd been cheated. "You owe us that voice, boy," one man had shouted outside the feed store. "We fed you, didn't we? We gave you coins." Elijah only nodded, shoulders squared. He'd never owed them anything. But somehow, it still felt like a loss for everyone. The man in the tan bowler didn't return. Not right away. His business was complete, the transaction closed. And Elijah never learned who the employer was or where the voice had gone. Was it bottled, copied, used in music halls on the other side of the country? He pictured a well-dressed gentleman in New York, standing behind a velvet curtain, singing into a phonograph while society women dabbed their eyes with lace gloves. Or maybe it had gone to something less human, a machine, a radio signal, a ghost-like echo floating through wires across the continent. It didn't matter now. It was gone. Still, Elijah learned to adapt. He used gestures when he could, chalkboards when paper ran low. The town got used to his quiet presence, the way his eyes did most of the talking. He was a familiar face now, not the singing boy, but the boy who once sang. But behind the new clothes and full pantry, the silence grew, not just in his throat, but in the corners of the house. At night, Mama would hum softly from her room, and Elijah would lie still, pressing his lips together to feel the vibrations he could no longer make. The music had been part of him, not just a skill, but a language, one he'd grown up speaking fluently. Now it was like waking up one morning and forgetting your own name. He started spending hours by the river, not fishing, not walking, just sitting, sketching in a leather notebook the doctor had given him. He drew faces from memory, people he'd sung for, people who'd dropped coins in his tin. He added lines of poetry under each sketch. "She gave me dimes when they weren't looking." He smiled only once, but it was honest. They never heard the last song. The notebook filled quickly. Then one morning, something changed. A girl appeared. She couldn't have been more than 12, with wild hair and a face full of freckles. She carried a bundle of laundry under one arm and stopped when she saw Elijah by the riverbank. "You're the voice boy," she said matter-of-factly. Elijah nodded. She studied him. "Mama says you sold it, that someone paid you money and took it, like it was a chicken or a mule." He smiled faintly, wrote a quick note, and handed it to her. "Pretty much." She squinted at the paper, then laughed. "That's dumb," she said. "You should have asked for double." And just like that, she plopped down beside him, no invitation needed. She started talking about her chores, her brothers, the way her mama cooked cabbage wrong. And Elijah listened, nodding when it made sense, smiling when it didn't. He realized something. He hadn't lost his voice entirely, not the part that mattered. He could still listen, still make people feel heard, still leave an echo. Maybe that was enough. By autumn, Elijah had become something of a fixture in town. Always around, always quiet, always scribbling. He wasn't a mystery anymore. He was a rhythm, a gentle kind of background music people noticed more when it stopped. And yet, even without a voice, he still found ways to earn. It started with small things. Helping Mr. Finch unload sacks of flour behind the bakery. Sweeping porches. Carrying packages for Miss Halloran, the dressmaker with too many cats and too few stays in her bones. He never had to say a word. People would just nod, gesture, point. And Elijah would move. Quiet and quick. Reliable in a way most grown men weren't. There was something almost elegant about it. The way he slipped into tasks without instruction. Always watching, always guessing what needed to be done. It felt like music in its own way, a silent choreography of errands and chores. Miss Halloran called it his ghost work. "It's like a helpful little spirit," she told her customers one day. "Floats in, floats out, and the brooms in the corner like it danced on its own." He made more now than he ever did singing. Not that the coins mattered as much. Not like before. He didn't feel poor anymore, not with a roof that didn't leak and Mama humming down the hall and stew that stretched all the way to morning. He'd given up something big, yes, but in return, life had gotten softer, more breathable, less desperate. Still, the silence was not always kind. He missed jokes, the kind you can't write down, the kind you have to deliver fast or they die mid-air. He missed talking back, saying things in real time. Banter, teasing, quick good mornings to folks passing by. People tried, of course. They waved more, smiled longer. But most conversations dried up after the first two exchanges. Not everyone had the patience to wait for handwriting. Some just gave up entirely, nodding politely before turning away. That part ached, being near people but not fully with them. At night, he and Mama would sit by the stove, sharing tea. She did most of the talking. He'd answer with scribbled words or gestures. But every now and then, she'd stop, reach over, and squeeze his hand. "You're still in there, baby," she'd whisper, even when it's quiet. "I still hear you." The girl from the river came back, too. Her name was Hazel, and she had opinions about everything. "Your hat's dumb," she said once, but in a cool way. Elijah smiled, tugging it down over his ears in mock shame. Hazel wasn't like the others. She didn't mind waiting for answers, didn't get tired of the silence. In fact, she filled it so much he barely noticed it some days. She'd sit beside him and chatter about school, dreams, soap making, clouds, buttons, goats, whatever her brain landed on. And sometimes, just sometimes, Elijah would write something down and hand it to her, and she'd laugh so loud it startled the crows. "See," she said, "told you." Still funny. One crisp October afternoon, as the leaves turned copper and the chimney smoke began to curl like ribbon, Hazel asked him something different. "Do you miss it?" She didn't point or gesture. She just looked at his throat, then his eyes. Elijah thought for a moment, then picked up his notebook. "I miss how people looked at me when I sang." Hazel read the note, then nodded solemnly. "Yeah, people are better when they are listening." He tapped the page again, wrote more. "They listen like I was important, even if just for a minute." She frowned a little. "You're still important. You just don't have a soundtrack now." That line stayed with him. No soundtrack, just silence, and action, and choice. 1 week later, he found an old harmonica at a second-hand store. It was dented on the side and rusted on one end. He bought it anyway, a few pennies only. He didn't know why. He couldn't exactly play it the way he used to sing. But he liked how it felt. Cool in his palm. Solid. Like a reminder. He carried it everywhere. And once, late at night, he sat on the back porch, the moonlight soft and silver, and tried blowing into it, gently, tentatively. Just a breath. A note came out. Wobbly. Thin. But real. Then another. Then a chord. The sound wavered. Didn't fill the air like his voice once had. But it was something. And more than that, it was his again. The harmonica stayed in his pocket for weeks. Sometimes he played it. More often, he didn't. It wasn't that he was afraid, just uncertain, like someone rediscovering a room in a house they'd forgotten existed. One afternoon, while Elijah was helping Hazel stack firewood behind her uncle's store, a strange man stepped off the stagecoach. He looked like he didn't belong. Everything about him seemed to shine. His boots were polished to a mirror gloss, his coat had pearl buttons that caught the sun like fish scales, and he carried a suitcase so silver it made folks squint. He was tall, pale, and elegant in a way that made people stop talking. Even the dogs went quiet when he passed. Nobody knew who he was. He didn't give a name, just walked straight down Main Street, nodded once at the blacksmith, and asked, voice clear and charming, "Is there a boy in town who sings without a voice?" The blacksmith blinked. "You mean Elijah?" The man smiled faintly. "Yes, Elijah." By the time Elijah got the message, sent by a girl running barefoot from the bakery, the man was already waiting outside the apothecary, seated calmly on a bench with his silver suitcase at his side. He rose when Elijah approached and looked him up and down like he was inspecting a rare instrument. Not cruelly, just carefully. "You're smaller than I imagined," the man said, still smiling. But silence tends to make things larger in the mind. Elijah tilted his head. The man didn't seem like the kind who liked jokes, but still, Elijah scribbled one on his notebook and held it out. And here I thought I was famous. The man chuckled. Just once. Oh, you are. Infamous, even. Word travels fast when it has nowhere else to go. He tapped the suitcase. I collect voices, Elijah. That made Elijah freeze. Not from fear, exactly, but from memory, from something deep in his belly that hadn't stirred in months. I don't steal them, the man clarified. I find ones that are already lost. Abandoned. Sold. Forgotten. I keep them. Archive them. Share them. When the time is right. He opened the case. It was lined with velvet. And inside, nestled like rare jewels, were tiny glass bottles. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Some glowed faintly. Others shimmered. One of them let out a soft laugh as it rolled. Elijah stared. Every bottle, the man said, contains a voice. Some were traded in desperation. Others were given freely. But yours was special. He reached into a side pocket and pulled out a smaller vial, one that looked foggy and still. No light, no sound. This one, he said, holding it gently, belonged to you. A perfect soprano, bruised with grief, polished by hunger. Elijah felt his throat tighten. I could return it, the man said, if you want it. Elijah's heart thumped once, hard. He wasn't sure how to answer. He reached for his notebook, but his hand hovered above the page, unsure what to write. Did he miss singing? Yes. Did he want his voice back? Maybe, but also, maybe not. His life had grown in new directions since he gave it up. His world had gotten wider, not smaller. He'd found ways to speak without sound. People saw him now, not just heard him. And yet, there was that ache, that soft, distant longing. The man watched him carefully, then placed the vial back in the suitcase. No rush, he said, but know this. If you choose to reclaim it, it won't be the same. You aren't the boy you were. He paused, and voices, like people, change in silence. Elijah nodded slowly. The man stood, brushed imaginary dust from his lapels, and began walking back toward the coach station. Then, as if remembering something, he turned and said, "By the way, your voice sang itself to sleep. It dreams of rivers and bread and laughter. Just thought you'd like to know." He tipped his hat, closed the suitcase, and vanished down the road, his boots clicking like clock hands. Elijah stood still for a long time. Then he pulled out his harmonica and played a tune he didn't know he knew. The tune Elijah played that day wasn't one he had ever practiced. It felt like something ancient, like it had lived inside him for a long time, waiting patiently beneath the silence. It wasn't fancy, just a few soft notes, rising and falling like the wind through wheat fields. But when he played it, people stopped to listen. Old Mr. Holcomb, who hadn't heard music since the war, paused mid-step and took off his hat. The baker's wife came out with flour still on her hands. Hazel stood near the well, her eyes wide and wet. Elijah kept playing. The sound wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It curled through the town like smoke. Soft, gentle, familiar. And when it was over, nobody clapped. They just stood there, quiet and full, like they had all eaten something warm and filling. Hazel walked over after the last note faded and simply said, "That was the saddest song I've ever loved." Elijah nodded and smiled. He knew. After that, things started to change again. Word of his music spread. Not just the legend of the boy who sold his voice, but the sound of him now. The way he spoke through his harmonica, through his eyes, through his stories written in chalk and passed from hand to hand. He became something new. Not the boy with the golden voice, but the boy who stayed after he lost it. The boy who turned silence into a kind of music all its own. Some nights, he played under the big oak tree near the mill. Kids gathered on blankets. Elderly folks brought rocking chairs. Travelers came from towns he'd never heard of. Nobody talked much during his performances. They just listened. Sometimes he'd write a single phrase on the chalkboard beside him. This one is about longing. Oh, close your eyes. Think of rain. He played songs that made people remember, or forget, or forgive. People gave him food, coins, letters. Some gave him secrets. One girl gave him a stone carved like a tiny A. She told him it could hear what hearts couldn't say. He carried it in his pocket after that. And sometimes, on quiet nights, he took out the notebook where he once scribbled jokes and instead wrote down dreams. One of those dreams was about the man with the silver suitcase. Elijah hadn't seen him since that day, but he thought of him often, wondered where he went, what voices he carried now, whether his own voice still dreamed of him from inside that glass bottle. Would it recognize him? Would he recognize it? He didn't know, but something inside him had shifted. He no longer missed his voice the way someone misses a limb. He missed it the way someone misses a childhood home, lovingly, but from a distance. One evening, Hazel brought him an envelope. It had no return address, just Elijah's name written in blue ink. Inside was a folded piece of music. No words, just notes on a page, delicate and looping like ribbon. And at the bottom, a single sentence. When you are ready, your voice is too. He didn't know what that meant. Not at first, but the music, he could hear it. In his head, in his chest. And one day, without quite meaning to, he began to hum. Not loud, barely more than breath. But it was there, a thin, trembling line of melody. Hazel turned, eyes wide. Was that? He covered his mouth, startled. Then he smiled and shrugged. A whisper, nothing more, but still, something. The next day, he sat under the oak tree and played again. But this time, just before he brought the harmonica to his lips, he sang. Only one word. Hello. The crowd gasped softly. It wasn't the voice he once had. It was smaller, rougher, not golden, but it was his. Born again through silence and sorrow and a harmonica that held every note he couldn't say. People didn't cheer. They wept. Because somehow, that one word said everything they needed to hear. By the time autumn rolled across the rooftops and left yellow lace in the trees, Elijah had become a name again. Not a myth, not a miracle, just a name people whispered when they needed something human and impossible. Some said he was a healer. Some said he had swallowed sorrow and turned it into something beautiful. Others said he had once bartered with a devil dressed like a gentleman. But the truth was quieter than that. He had lost something, and he had found something else. He hadn't spoken much since that evening under the oak tree, not with full sentences, anyway. His voice was still new and shy. It fluttered like a sparrow that had forgotten how to land. So mostly, he still wrote. Short sentences, soft thoughts, chalk sketches on the town wall. Notes he tucked into people's coat pockets when they weren't looking. But people kept coming. They didn't come just to hear him anymore. They came to feel something. Anything. A little stillness. A little ache. A little hope. That's when the letters began to arrive. Thick envelopes. Strange stamps. Wax seals shaped like birds and stars and clocks. The first came from Missouri. Then New York. Then New Orleans. Inside were strange requests. One man wrote, "Can you play me a tune that makes me forget the face of my brother?" A woman wrote, "I haven't cried in 10 years. Make me." Another, "I sold my dreams for a job I hate. Tell me I can still change." Elijah read them all, and then he did what he always did. He listened. He listened to the air, to the way his feet felt on the porch, to the way wind pushed against the shutters. And then he played, not for money, not for fame, but because these were people who, like him, had lost something. He called them the hollow ones, not because they were broken, but because they were still open, like cups waiting to be filled again. People began to leave items at his door, not money or food this time, but things, weird things. A pocket watch that ran backwards, a bottle of rain from a funeral day, a photograph of a smile that had long since faded, a comb with one tooth missing, the one my mother used every Sunday. Each item came with a request. Can you turn this into music? And he did, one by one. He'd sit by the firelight, fingers on wood, breath steady, and draw from the object not what it was, but what it meant. He played a jagged tune for the comb, soft and prickly at once, a shimmering hum for the photo, with pauses where the memory hurt too much. And for the bottle of funeral rain, he played something that felt like it never ended. Just a single note, stretched and trembling, like the sky hadn't finished grieving. Someone called it the auction of strange things. But it wasn't buying or selling anymore. It was returning. A way for people to give away what they couldn't carry, and for Elijah to turn it into something someone else could hold. He started keeping a notebook, not just of songs, but of what people gave him. Today, a girl brought me her brother's shoelaces. She said he ran away and never tied them right. I played her a lullaby for feet that never stopped. A man gave me a list of every person he never apologized to. I played him a song full of open doors. Elijah no longer needed a voice to speak. He had become a kind of translator for the soul. And through it all, his own voice grew braver. He could now say simple things. Thank you. Oh, I remember. Oh, let's try again. Each word like a candle, small but sure, lighting the path through his silence. Hazel said once, "You're not the boy who lost his voice. You're the boy who taught the rest of us how to use ours." Elijah only smiled, because that felt true. He wasn't special. He had just paid attention. He had heard, and he had healed, and somewhere in between, he had opened a door. And now, every person who came to him left with something different than they expected. They came for a song, but they left with themselves. One foggy evening in late October, as the trees let go of their final leaves like forgotten promises, a girl knocked on Elijah's door. She was small, thin as a page, wrapped in a patchwork coat too big for her and mittens too small. She didn't speak at first, just held out a glass jar. Inside it, nothing, or at least, nothing you could see. But Elijah, now something of an expert in invisible things, nodded solemnly and invited her in. They sat by the stove, where fire whispered like an old friend. She didn't smile, but her eyes flickered with something soft, familiar. Eventually, she spoke. Her voice was raw and gravelly, like it had been dug out of a dry well. "I've got this cough," she said, tapping the jar. "Been with me since I was 4. Elijah looked confused. She shrugged. "It's not just a cough. It's the cough. Shows up every time I get scared. When I have to speak in front of people. When I lie. When I remember things I shouldn't." She paused, twisting the jar in her hands. "Doctor called it nerves. Ma called it a curse. I call it mine." Elijah gently took the jar, holding it to the light. There was nothing in it, and yet he could hear a faint rattle, like leaves trapped in a chimney, like a secret that wouldn't sit still. He wrote slowly on a slip of paper, "What do you want me to do with it?" She stared at the fire, then said, "Turn it into something beautiful." For a long while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The world outside breathed frost onto the windows. Then Elijah picked up his old guitar, the one that still carried the sound of dust and dreams and things unsaid. He didn't ask for money, didn't ask for her name. He just played. Not a loud tune, not a dramatic one. Something quiet, cozy, like someone humming to themselves while folding laundry. A tune that made you feel like you were being rocked. Safe. Understood. He leaned into the music and imagined what the cough felt like. Not just in the throat, but in the heart. The sting of it, the shame, the involuntary truth of it. He imagined a girl trying to hold words inside so tightly they shook her apart. Then he imagined those words learning to trust her again, learning to walk beside her, not hide. The song had pauses, creaks, sudden sparks of light, like her. At the end, he opened the jar and let the last note fall inside. It shimmered, just slightly. The glass steamed over, and the girl, she exhaled. Not a cough, just a breath. Free and clean. Tears formed, but didn't fall. She nodded, stood up, and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned and whispered, "You played me safe." Elijah only smiled. The jar sat on the shelf now, labeled the Golden Cough. Visitors sometimes asked what it was. He never told them, because some songs aren't for sharing. They are for keeping. Years passed like sleepy Sunday afternoons. Elijah's small cottage, once barely noticed at the edge of town, became something else entirely. Not a shop, not quite a home, more like a museum of unspoken things. People didn't come to buy anymore. They came to unburden. There were no advertisements, no sign out front, no prices on shelves. And yet, if you had something stuck in your chest, a secret, a sorrow, a story too fragile to say out loud. You eventually found your way to Elijah's porch. They came by train, by foot. Some came in silence. Some came humming nervously. All came carrying something invisible. And Elijah, he still never spoke. He didn't have to. His face, now older and dusted with laugh lines, did all the talking. He'd open the door, usher them in with a nod, and offer a warm drink. Sometimes they cried immediately. Sometimes they needed hours. But always, always, they left lighter. Not fixed, not changed, just heard. Inside the house were jars, hundreds of them, each one filled with a sound. Not voices exactly, but echoes of feeling. A father's apology, never said. A child's bedtime song, long forgotten. The sound of a door closing that should have stayed open. The breath right before I love you that never made it past the lips. They lined the walls like glowing fireflies in glass prisons. But they weren't sad. They shimmered. Some glowed warm like candlelight. Others pulsed soft blue. Some crackled faintly like static from an old radio. A few even giggled. Once in a while. Visitors asked if he ever played them back. He didn't. That wasn't the point. The point was holding them. Giving them a place to live where they wouldn't be judged, erased, or forgotten. Because every sound, Elijah believed, deserved a home. Even the ugly ones. Even the scared ones. Even the ones people wish they'd never made. One winter night, a man arrived who didn't bring a sound. He brought a question. Why do you do it? He asked, warming his hands near the stove. Elijah pawed tea, then wrote something slowly on a piece of paper and handed it over. Because no one ever did it for me. The man looked at him a long time, then nodded. They didn't speak again. They just sat today, two souls, breathing the same quiet air. In town, they had many names for Elijah. The mute musician, the jar man, the voice keeper. But none of them really captured him. To some, he was a curiosity. To others, a legend. To most, a mystery they didn't know they needed until they arrived at his door. Children whispered that his jars could talk at midnight. Old women swore his house was warmer than any other on the coldest nights. Teenagers dared each other to knock on his door and leave with a song. But the truth? Elijah was just a boy who had once been unheard, and who now made it his life's work to hear others. Not fix, not teach, just witness. And sometimes, that was enough to turn pain into poetry. As he aged, Elijah began filling fewer jars. He no longer needed to catch every sound. He'd sit on his porch, guitar in hand, letting the breeze carry what it would. Sometimes he strummed. Sometimes he simply listened to the trees speak their own tired stories. And sometimes, rarely, but sweetly, he smiled and opened an old jar, just for a moment, to remember, not to relive, just to honor. Because Elijah had learned something that few ever do. That a voice doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. That silence can hold more truth than words. And that the deepest stories in the world don't shout. They whisper, and wait for someone quiet enough to hear them. By the time the boy turned 27, his voice was no longer his own. It belonged to scripts, to promises, to faceless clients, to the endless parade of products and courses and dreams for sale. He had become a ghost in a recording booth, a whisper for hire. No longer the boy with the brilliant idea, just a man who said what he was paid to say. He still sat at the same desk, same chair, same lamp with the chipped base. But now the MIC stared at him like a quiet overseer, blinking red, waiting for the next take. The same routine, day in and day out. Coffee, script, read, upload, repeat. Once, someone sent him a message. They wrote, "Your voice helped me through a rough time." And he stayed at it for a long while, unsure how to feel. Because the voice they were thanking didn't feel like his anymore. Somewhere along the way, the boy had traded wonder for workflow. He'd stopped hearing the sound of his own thoughts and learned to mimic the rhythms people liked. He wasn't unhappy, just emptied, polished, marketable. He could still walk outside and hear birds, still see sunsets, still feel rain on his skin. But he no longer narrated them. He had run out of words that were just for him. One day, he tried recording something without a client, just for himself. A small story, an idea. But he stumbled. Restarted. Deleted. Nothing felt right. Every phrase sounded like it belonged in someone else's funnel. And so, he sat there, quiet, still, and for the first time in years, he just listened. To the faint hum of the city, to the creak in the wall, to his own slow breath. And in that hush, a question arrived. Not loud, not urgent, but soft and clear. What would you say if no one paid you to say it? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But the question stayed with him. It echoed, not in his inbox, not in the comments, not in the stats, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that still remembered the little boy in the attic, with a plastic MIC and a head full of wonder. Maybe, he thought, the real voice is the one you speak, even when no one's listening. And just like that, he closed the laptop, and for a moment longer than usual, he let the silence stretch,